My name is Norris Litchfield, and in my 68 years, I have learned one simple truth. Never show people your true capabilities, especially family, especially children. Penelope and I lived most of our lives in a neat one-story house on Alder Street in suburban Delano. It was a pleasant three-bedroom structure with a well-kept garden and good, though not luxurious, furnishings. The neighbors thought we were a typical middle-income couple. Penelope worked as a high school English teacher, and I worked as a financial analyst for a small local company. No one realized that behind this facade of ordinary life was a fortune that I had been methodically building for almost 4 decades. Even Penelope didn't know the whole truth. I'd always been good with numbers. In the 80s, when the computerized era of the financial sector began, I developed several algorithms to predict market fluctuations. My colleagues laughed at the endless tables and charts. Norris believes in the magic of numbers, they said. None of them ever realized that behind the apparent mediocrity lurked a subtle calculation. Penelope had no interest in investments or financial markets. Money is just a tool, Norris, nothing more, she would repeat when I tried to tell her about another investment opportunity. Over time, I stopped sharing my financial affairs with her, and she stopped asking. This tacit agreement formed on its own. I started small, a few stocks of local companies, bonds, small investments in the stock market. Gradually, my investments grew, as did my understanding of the market. By the early 2000s, I could have been out of work, but I continued to put on my usual suit every morning and drive to the office in a reliable, though not new, sedan. Penelope never complained about our modest existence, and I saw no reason to change. Our only son, Gilbert, had shown signs of ambition since childhood. At school, he was always striving to be first, and in college, he was the head of the student council. I paid for his education at a prestigious university, but he took it for granted. When he brought his fiancée, Delancey, a cold and calculating girl from a wealthy family, into our home, I saw in her eyes a slight disappointment in our modest accommodations. "Your house is so cozy," she said then, unable to hide the condescending note in her voice. I knew Delancey dreamed of a rich husband. Gilbert, then a junior manager at a technology company called TechnoAge, promised her a bright future. He had always been obsessed with success and money, and in this he and I differed fundamentally. For me, money was a means to security and independence. For him, it was a measure of success and status. After they married, Gilbert and Delancey bought a large house in the upscale Delano neighborhood. I suspected they had gotten into serious debt, but never commented on it. Our relationship became increasingly strained. They called rarely, visited even less often. Penelope suffered from this estrangement, but never complained out loud. 2 months ago, Penelope passed away. Suddenly, a heart attack. The morning she made her signature cinnamon oatmeal, and an hour later I was on my way to the hospital, clutching the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The doctors did everything they could, but it was too late. A part of me died with her that day. At the funeral, Gilbert and Delancey stood beside me, respectful. Their sympathy seemed mechanical, rehearsed. After the ceremony, they left immediately, citing important meetings. I was left alone in an empty house that suddenly became too big for one person. The following weeks passed like a blur. I continued to live by inertia, not tasting the food and not noticing the change of days. At times, I caught myself talking to Penelope as if she had just stepped out into the garden and was about to return. And then there was the plumbing emergency. I was at the bank checking on the status of my investments when a neighbor called with news of a burst pipe. By the time I returned, the water had already flooded the living room and kitchen, damaging the walls and floor. The insurance company had assessed the damage and promised compensation, but repairs took time. Just then, to my surprise, Gilbert called. "Dad, I heard about the breach. You need somewhere to live while the repairs are being made. Why don't you come stay with us?" His suggestion took me by surprise. After so many years of a cool relationship, this sudden gesture seemed suspicious, but I was too exhausted from grief and domestic problems to resist. "Thank you, son. If it won't be an inconvenience, I could stay with you for a couple weeks." "Sure, no problem." His voice sounded cheerful, almost forced. "Delancey and I would be delighted. I could easily rent an apartment or even buy a new house. My condition allowed me to do so without thinking twice. But something inside, perhaps a desire to know my son's true attitude, or just a reluctance to be alone at such a difficult time, pushed me to accept his offer. When I arrived at their house with 2 suitcases, Delancey greeted me with a strained smile. Their house was exactly what I expected. Modern, cold, impersonal. The guest bedroom they'd assigned me looked immaculate, but impersonal like a room in a nice hotel. "Make yourself comfortable, Dad." "Make yourself at home," Gilbert said, quickly showing me to my room. "Dinner's at 7. We usually have everyone eat what they want, but Delancey's going to cook something special tonight." That first dinner turned out to be awkward. Delancey served lasagna that tasted like frozen convenience food, even though she assured me she had cooked it herself. Gilbert talked about his work, bragging about non-existent successes. I pretended to listen with interest. "How are your finances, Dad?" Gilbert suddenly asked. "Will insurance cover the repairs? Do you need any help?" "I'll manage," I replied succinctly. "Been handling it all my life." They exchanged quick glances, the meaning of which I couldn't decipher. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, I thought of Penelope, of our cozy home, of the life we'd built together, and of the strange twist of fate that had brought me under the roof of a son with whom I had little in common. The next morning brought the first hint of how my stay here would turn out. I went down to the kitchen around 8 o'clock to make myself some coffee. Gilbert was already there, dressed in an expensive suit and engrossed in his phone. "Ah, Dad, you're awake," he said, without taking his eyes off the screen. "Coffee's in the locker on the right. And by the way, could you load the dishwasher? Delancey and I are in a hurry to get to work." It was a small thing, but the tone in which he said it, as if it went without saying that I'd be doing my homework, made me wary. Delancey came down a few minutes later, impeccably dressed and with perfect makeup. "Good morning, Norris," she said without even glancing at me. "There's a grocery list on the dining room table. It would be great if you could go to the store today. Oh, and the laundry room is in the basement if you want to wash your stuff." They left without waiting for my response, leaving me alone in their perfectly furnished kitchen with a cup of cooling coffee in my hand. At that moment, I didn't yet know how much worse things would get, but even then, I sensed the first signs of disrespect that would turn into open defiance in the following weeks. I looked at the shopping list on the table and wondered for the first time if I had made a mistake in accepting my son's offer. In the 2 weeks of living in Gilbert and Delancey's house, I had become a domestic servant. What started with an innocent request to load the dishwasher quickly grew into an endless list of chores. Every morning I found on the kitchen table a to-do list for the day, written in Delancey's neat handwriting. Buy groceries, do laundry, vacuum, cook dinner. That Tuesday, the list was especially long. I was sitting at the table, sipping my coffee and looking at the task paper, when Delancey walked into the kitchen, already fully dressed for work. "Good morning, Norris," she tossed, pouring herself some coffee into a travel mug. I added replacing the light bulbs in the upstairs bathroom to the list. "They've been flickering for a week now. Just unbearable." I folded the sheet and tucked it into my shirt pocket. "I'm not an electrician, Delancey." She looked at me with mild surprise, as if she hadn't expected an objection. "It's just light bulbs." "Gilbert's always too busy for little things like that, and you're home all day anyway." "I have a meeting with a contractor today about fixing up the house," I pointed out. Delancey rolled her eyes. "It'll take 5 minutes, Norris. The light bulbs are in the cabinet under the sink. And please don't forget dinner. Gilbert and I are going to be late tonight, but I'd like to come home to a cooked meal." She whisked out of the kitchen, leaving behind a plume of expensive perfume and a feeling that my time and convenience were of no consequence. Gilbert came down a few minutes later, tying his tie on the fly. "Dad, have you seen my blue notebook? The one with the company logo on it?" "No," I replied, watching him frantically rummage through the stack of papers on the edge of his desk. "Damn, I needed it for today's meeting." He ran a hand through his hair, ruffling it even more. "Could you look for it while I'm gone? He should be around here somewhere. And by the way, my white shirts need to be picked up from the dry cleaners. The address is in the phone book." I nodded silently, suppressing the urge to remind him that I was his father, not his personal assistant. Gilbert grabbed his briefcase and ran out of the house without even saying goodbye. Left alone, I slowly finished my coffee, looking out the window at the manicured backyard. I remembered how Gilbert had run around our modest garden as a child, how we'd built a birdhouse together, how I'd taught him to ride a bicycle. Where had that inquisitive boy with the bright eyes disappeared to? When did he turn into this superficial, selfish man? I tried to remember if there were signs of this back in his childhood. Gilbert had always been persistent, sometimes even stubborn. When he was 10, he demanded a new bicycle, even though the old one was perfectly serviceable. At 16, he insisted on his own car, which Penelope and I couldn't afford, or rather chose not to buy, though I could have. In college, he complained constantly about his limited budget, comparing himself to his more affluent peers. Maybe I pampered him too much, or was I being too strict? Penelope always said I demanded too much from him. He's just a kid, Norris. Let him enjoy his childhood. Or maybe the problem was that Penelope and I lived modestly when we could afford so much more. Had we created an inferiority complex in Gilbert by our perceived financial limitations? My musings were interrupted by the phone ringing. It was the contractor informing me that it would take at least another 3 weeks for Penelope and me to renovate our house. I was not happy about the news, but I consoled myself with the thought that I would soon be back to my usual independence. After the call, I still decided to fulfill part of Delancey's list to avoid conflict. I went to the dry cleaner, changed the light bulbs in the bathroom, and bought groceries for dinner. On the way back, I stopped by a local coffee shop where I usually spent time with my laptop, checking on the status of my investments. At a nearby table sat 2 men in business suits, engrossed in conversation. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when I heard the name Techno Age, I was involuntarily wary. The problem is that the company needs a major investor, or there will be serious layoffs in 6 months, said one of them, a short man with graying hair. His interlocutor nodded. I hear they're looking for $5 million to expand the production line. Without that money, their competitors will just eat them alive. I carefully pulled out my laptop and, pretending to mind my own business, continued to listen to the conversation. Apparently, the company where Gilbert and Delancey worked was in serious financial trouble. Their new product required significant investment, and current investors were hesitant. That explained Gilbert's nervousness in recent weeks, and perhaps their sudden hospitality towards me. They were clearly afraid of losing their jobs, and thus their ability to pay the mortgage on their luxury home. I opened my browser and began to explore. Techno Age was indeed in a difficult position. Their stock had been falling for the last 3 quarters, with competitors launching more innovative products. The company was urgently looking for an investor willing to invest a large sum of money in exchange for a controlling interest. Interesting. Very interesting. In the evening, I made dinner, baked chicken and vegetables. When Gilbert and Delancey got home, it was almost 9 o'clock. They entered the kitchen with tense faces, clearly after a hard day's work. It smells delicious, Delancey said as she took off her coat. At least there's something good about this day. Gilbert silently opened the bottle of wine and poured himself a full glass, which he drank almost in a volley. Rough day? I asked, arranging the food on plates. Not a word for it, Gilbert muttered. The board has been pushing management all day. If we don't find an investor soon, layoffs will start. Delancey threw him a warning glance. Gilbert, I don't think your father is interested in the company's problems. Actually, he is, I objected. I was a financial analyst for 30 years after all. Gilbert looked at me with mild surprise. Really? I never realized you were interested in anything other than your tables and charts. Those tables and graphs were my job, Gilbert. I set the plates on the table. And I was pretty good at it. Delancey snorted but held back the comment. Gilbert poured himself more wine. If you must know, the company needs an investor willing to put $5 million into a new production line, he said. Without that, we simply won't survive in the market. I nodded, pretending this information was new to me. And what are the chances of finding such an investor? Honestly, not very high, Gilbert rubbed his eyes. Most potential investors consider the risk too high. What about your position? I asked. In the event of layoffs, we're safe, Delancey replied quickly. Gilbert has a good relationship with management, and my department is too important to the company's image. Her confidence seemed contrived, and I noticed Gilbert winced slightly at her words. After dinner, they retired to the living room to watch TV, leaving me to clear the table and wash the dishes that couldn't be loaded into the dishwasher. I didn't mind. It gave me time to think. Investing 5 million was a manageable task for me. My fortune, neatly spread over various assets, was well in excess of that amount. But was it worth investing in a company in such a precarious position? From a purely business point of view, probably not. But from the perspective of a man living as a servant in his own son's house for 2 weeks, it could be an interesting experiment. The next morning, the story repeated itself. The to-do list on the kitchen table, the hurried request before leaving for work. But this time, Delancey added a new item. Norris, we're having a small dinner for coworkers on Saturday. I've left recipes and a guest list. It's nothing complicated, just need to have everything ready by 6 p.m. I looked at her puzzled. You want me to cook for your guests? Well, yeah, she shrugged as if it went without saying. You're going to be home anyway. And you're a pretty good cook, judging by last night's dinner. I felt anger boiling up inside, but held back. What if I have other plans for Saturday? Delancey raised her eyebrows in surprise. You have plans? Her tone, that condescending question, as if a person my age couldn't have a life of her own, finally pissed me off. Yes, Delancey, I do have plans, and they don't include being your personal chef. She frowned. You live in our house, Norris. I don't think helping with a little dinner is such a big ask. I'm living in your house temporarily, at your own invitation, I reminded her, and I am grateful for that. But that does not make me your servant. At that moment, Gilbert entered the kitchen, already ready to leave. What's going on? He asked, shifting his gaze from me to Delancey. Your father is refusing to help with Saturday night dinner, she said with a hurt look. Gilbert sighed. Dad, we're just asking for a little help. Is it difficult for you? It's not about difficult, Gilbert. It's about respect. I stood up from the table. Ever since I moved here, you've been treating me like free labor. I don't mind helping around the house, but I won't fulfill the role of your personal cook and cleaner. Gilbert exchanged a glance with Delancey. You do realize we both work full-time, right? We have busy schedules. We just thought you might want to be helpful since you're living here for free. For free? I repeated. You offered to let me stay here because my house is being renovated. I didn't ask for it. And if I had known it would oblige me to become your servant, I would have preferred to rent an apartment. No one is making you a servant, Gilbert objected, but you must realize that your staying here creates additional expenses. Electricity bills, water bills, groceries. I couldn't believe my ears. My own son, earning a six-figure sum a year, insinuating that I was burdening him with my presence. If it's a matter of money, I can pay my own living expenses, I said coldly. Name the amount. Gilbert blushed. It's not about money, Dad. It's about mutual aid. We've provided you with a roof over your head in a time of need, and it seemed natural to us that you'd want to thank us in some way. Thank you by becoming your servant? I shook my head. I'm your father, Gilbert. I changed your diapers, taught you to read, paid for your education, and now you think I should be grateful for the opportunity to cook and clean for you? Delancey glanced defiantly at her watch. We should get to work. We can discuss this tonight. They left, leaving me in the silence of the kitchen, alone with my thoughts and my growing irritation. After they left, I sat down at my laptop and continued yesterday's research. TechnoAge was a publicly traded company, but the controlling interest was owned by the founder, who was now looking for a buyer. I contacted my financial advisor and made an appointment for the afternoon. I was met at the consulting firm's office by Hugh Barlow, with whom I had worked for 15 years. He was one of the few people who knew the true extent of my fortune. Norris, good to see you. He shook my hand firmly. My condolences about Penelope. She was a wonderful woman. Thank you, Hugh. Yes, she was. We settled into his office and I outlined my interest in TechnoAge. Financially, it's a risky investment, Hugh said, looking at the data on his computer. The company is losing market position. Their technology is becoming obsolete. But if you invest enough to develop a new production line, they have a chance. Is 5 million enough money? For starters, yes. It will give them the respite they need and the opportunity to launch a new product. But are you really interested in this company? It's not exactly your usual investment profile. I smiled. Let's just say I have a personal interest. My son and his wife work there. Hugh nodded understandingly. Oh, that's what it is. You want to help them keep their jobs? Not really, I told him about my situation and how I was being treated at Gilbert House. Hugh listened with increasing amazement. And you want to buy the company to, what? To get back at them? I'd call it a lesson. Sometimes people need to be reminded of simple things like respecting your parents. Hugh leaned back in his chair, contemplating the situation. That's a possibility. I can arrange a meeting with the founder of TechnoAge. He's looking for a quick deal without too much publicity. But are you sure you want to go that route? I remembered all the humiliation of the last few weeks, the to-do lists on my desk, the condescending glances, the treatment like a burden. Yes, Hugh, I'm absolutely sure. Returning home, I felt a strange excitement. For the first time in a long time, I had a purpose, something that superseded the pain of losing Penelope. I was going to teach my son and his wife a lesson they would not soon forget. After our conflict that morning, the atmosphere in the house had become even more strained. Gilbert and Delancey stopped leaving written to-do lists, but their expectations hadn't changed. They still felt I should do chores in exchange for hospitality. I continued to help around the house to a reasonable extent, but no longer allowed myself to be used as a servant. Hugh scheduled a meeting with the founder of TechnoAge for the following week, and I began to prepare for it by studying all the available information about the company. It turned out that they did have a promising product, a small business automation system that could greatly expand their customer base. The only problem was a lack of development and marketing funds. On Saturday, the day of their planned dinner with coworkers, I decided to leave the house for the day, avoiding potential conflict. In the morning, I informed Delancey that I had a meeting with a contractor in other business and would be back late that evening. On the day of our dinner, her voice sounded both surprised and accusing. Gilbert said you agreed to help. I didn't agree, Delancey, and I've already told you both that I won't play the role of your cook. She pressed her lips together, clearly holding back her irritation. Fine. We'll have to order food. Can you at least mop the living room floors before you leave? There's residue left there from last night's rain. I held back a sigh. Okay, I'll mop the floors. She nodded like it was the least I could do and walked out of the kitchen. I found a mop in the pantry and began scrubbing the living room floor, carefully removing the dirty marks near the front door. Finished, I put away my inventory and went up to my room to change before going out. As I walked back downstairs, I heard the voices of Gilbert and Delancey returning from the grocery store. Damn, Gil! Look how dirty the hallway floor is! Delancey sounded annoyed. Norris! I walked down the stairs and saw them both standing there with bags of groceries. There were indeed fresh footprints on the clean floor, obviously left by their shoes. You said you'd mop the floor, Gilbert said accusingly, setting the bags on the hallway table. I did mop. Half an hour ago. These are your new footprints, Delancey snorted. Then wash again. We have guests in 5 hours, and this place looks like a pigsty. I felt anger boiling up inside me. If you want a clean floor, why don't you take your shoes off when you come in, or clean up after yourself? Gilbert sighed irritably. Geez, Dad, how hard can it be? Just get a rag and wipe the floor. Delancey and I have a lot more to get ready for tonight. I've already mopped the floor, Gilbert. Now I'm getting ready to leave. Really? Delancey threw me a scornful look. That's so childish. Is it hard for you to help? At that moment, Gilbert, apparently determined to end the argument, grabbed a rag lying on the shelf by the entrance and threw it irritably in my direction. Wipe the floor, servant. Isn't that what you're here for? The rag hit my chest and fell to the floor. Silence reigned in the room. Delancey froze with her mouth open. Gilbert seemed shocked at his own act. I slowly bent down, picked up the rag, and placed it carefully on the table by the entrance, then looked directly into my son's eyes. Now I know exactly what I'm here for. I walked around them and out of the house without another word. In the car, I sat for a few minutes, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. In my entire life, no one had ever treated me with such blatant disdain as my own son. I started the engine and drove away with no particular goal in mind. A short time later, I found myself outside Penelope's and my house. Construction workers were working on the roof, and new frames were visible in the windows. The progress was obvious, but I didn't want to go back there anymore. Not after Penelope had died. The house without her was just a structure, a set of rooms filled with memories that now hurt. What would you do in my place, Pen? I whispered, looking at our house. I could almost hear her voice, soft but determined. What you think is right, Norris. As always, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Hugh. Can we meet today? An hour later, we were sitting in his office. I recounted what had happened this morning, not hiding my anger and frustration. I want to move faster, Hugh. Tomorrow, if possible. He raised his eyebrows. The meeting with Blakelock I can reschedule for tomorrow, if you're sure. But aren't you in a hurry? 5 million is a serious sum, even for you. This isn't just a business decision, Hugh. It's a personal one. He looked at me carefully. That's exactly why I'm worried. Personal emotions aren't the best basis for investment. In this case, that's exactly what I need. Hugh gave in. All right, I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow. But before that, we need to talk to a lawyer. If we act, we need to make sure everything is drawn up flawlessly. I woke up the next morning with a clear head and a firm decision. While Gilbert and Delancey were still asleep, it was Sunday, and they must have stayed up late with guests. I quietly gathered the necessary papers and left the house. Hugh was already waiting for me in his office along with Marilyn Hover, a corporate lawyer with an impeccable reputation. Mr. Litchfield, she extended her hand to shake mine. Hugh explained the situation. I've prepared all the necessary paperwork, but before we proceed, I want to make sure you fully understand the implications. I understand, I replied, and I'm ready. We spent 2 hours discussing the details of the deal, the risks, and the legal aspects. Marilyn was amazingly thorough, envisioning every possible scenario. By the end of our conversation, I had a clear plan of action. At noon, we met with Frederick Blakelock, founder of Techno Age, in the conference room of an expensive hotel. Blakelock was a tall, gray-haired man with sharp features and a penetrating gaze. He got straight to the point. Mr. Litchfield, Hugh tells me you're interested in acquiring a controlling interest in my company. That's correct, I nodded. I've reviewed your financial statements and business plan. You have excellent potential, but need the funds to realize a new production line. Blakelock watched me carefully. Many investors don't see it that way. They only see the current problems and falling stock. I'm not many investors, I smiled. I see the promise of your automation system for small businesses. With the right funding and marketing, it could take a significant market share. Blakelock relaxed slightly. Finally, someone who really understands our product. Are you in this field? I'm a former financial analyst, been investing for over 30 years. He nodded respectfully. And what's your price? $5 million for a 51% stake, I said, provided you remain on the board of directors as a consultant. Blakelock frowned. $6 million. $5,250,000, and the deal should close tomorrow, I replied. I have other investment options waiting for my decision. We haggled for another half hour until we settled on the sum of $5.5 million. Marilyn fixed all the details in the paperwork, and we set the final signing for tomorrow morning. There's one more thing, I said when the major issues were settled. I want my name off the public records. Everything will be handled through a trust. Blakelock raised an eyebrow. An unusual request. I have personal reasons. I assure you, everything will be perfectly legal. He shrugged. I don't care what the transaction is formalized through, as long as the money arrives in the account tomorrow. It will arrive, I assured him. When I got back to Gilbert and Delancey's house, they were sitting in the kitchen with tense faces. They were obviously waiting for me. Dad, Gilbert began as soon as I entered, about yesterday. I want to apologize. I was wrong to throw that rag. It was unacceptable. His apology sounded sincere, but I knew my son. He wasn't apologizing out of genuine remorse, but because he realized he'd crossed the line and was afraid of the consequences. Accepted, I said briefly. Delancey tried to smile. We left you dinner. And by the way, the evening went great, even though you couldn't attend. I noticed their attempt to get back to normal, but I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened. I'm not hungry, and I have an important meeting early tomorrow. Gilbert frowned. A meeting? What kind of meeting? Business, I replied, heading for the stairs. I'll see you tonight. I sensed their perplexed looks but didn't turn around. Tomorrow promised to be an interesting day, and I wanted to get a good night's sleep. In the morning, I got up early and put on my best suit and tie. Gilbert and Delancey were already in the kitchen getting ready for the work week. Wow, Dad, where are you dressed up like that? Gilbert asked, looking up from his coffee. To a meeting I told you yesterday. Delancey looked me over with mild surprise. You look solid. What kind of meeting? You'll see. I poured myself some coffee and sat down at the table. By the way, what time do you usually come into the office? They exchanged perplexed glances. By 9, Gilbert replied. Why? Just wondering. I finished my coffee and stood up. Have a good day at work. I arrived at the Techno Age office by 8 o'clock. Blakelock was already waiting for me in his office, along with Marilyn and 2 other board members. We quickly completed the formalities, signed all the documents, and I made the bank transfer for $5.5 million. Congratulations, Mr. Litchfield, Blakelock said, shaking my hand. You are now officially the majority owner of Techno Age. I can't say it's easy for me to part with control of the company I created, but I'm glad it's in good hands. I'll do my best to justify your trust. Marilyn handed me a folder of paperwork. It's all official. You can now introduce yourself to the board and staff at any time. Immediately, I said, please call an emergency meeting of the board of directors and department heads for 9:30. Blakelock raised his eyebrows in surprise. So soon? I don't like to postpone important business. At 9:30, I stood in the conference room of Techno Age's headquarters, waiting for the meeting to begin. Through the glass wall, I watched the company executives enter the room, talking among themselves. Gilbert wasn't among them. He wasn't senior enough to sit on the board. At precisely 9:30, Blakelock stood up and addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I have gathered you to introduce the new owner of the controlling interest in Techno Age. This morning, a deal was closed that will provide our company with the necessary funds to develop a new production line and marketing campaign. Allow me to introduce Mr. Norris Litchfield. I stepped forward to the sound of restrained applause and polite smiles. But the first thing I noticed was the shocked face of my son standing in the doorway of the conference room with a folder of documents in his hands. He had obviously been asked to bring something to the meeting, and now he froze, unable to believe his eyes. Thank you, Frederick, I addressed the crowd. I am honored to be a part of Techno Age. I've been watching your company for a long time and believe in its potential. With the right management and enough investment, we can take it to the next level. I talked about plans and strategies, about new opportunities and prospects, but all the time I was watching Gilbert out of the corner of my eye. He stood motionless, his face pale and his eyes dilated with shock. After my presentation and a few questions from the board members, I called for a short break. When most of the executives had left the room, I approached my son, still standing at the door. Gilbert, what a surprise to see you here. He gulped. Dad, what's going on? What's this all about? I smiled. Isn't it obvious? I just became your boss. A tense silence hung in the conference room. Gilbert stood in the doorway, unable to take his eyes off his father, who had just been introduced as the new owner of the company. The file folder slipped from his weakened fingers, scattering papers across the floor. We'll continue in 15 minutes, I announced to the assembled executives, who watched our silent scene with curiosity. When the hall emptied, I approached my son. His face was pale as if he had seen a ghost. How is that possible? His voice trembled. Where did you get that kind of money? I allowed myself a slight smile. All my life I've been saving and investing, Gilbert. Your mother never emphasized money, and I saw no reason to brag about my financial successes. But $5 million? He shook his head, unable to comprehend what he had heard. 5.5, I corrected, and that's only a fraction of my assets. Gilbert opened his mouth but couldn't utter a word. His world was crumbling before his eyes. All his life he had thought of his father as a humble servant with a disability, a man who could be patted on the shoulder and sent to scrub the floors. Now, however, he stood before his new boss. We need to talk, I said, but not here and not now. Tonight, at home. In the meantime, please gather up those papers and get back to your duties. I have a lot of work to do. I left him in a daze and returned to the conference room where the executives were already gathering to continue the meeting. We spent the next 2 hours discussing the company's growth strategy, financing a new production line, and reorganizing departments. I was in my element, operating with numbers and business concepts. Many of those present were surprised by my competence. They probably expected to see just a rich investor, not someone with a deep understanding of the financial market and the technology sector. Toward the end of the meeting, one of the executives asked a question that no doubt piqued everyone's interest. Mr. Litchfield, what are your plans for the current leadership of the company? I looked around at those present. At this point, I don't plan any drastic changes in senior management. You are all professionals in your field, and I appreciate your expertise. However, some mid-level restructuring is inevitable to improve efficiency. After the meeting, I was intercepted by Blakelock. Impressive performance, Norris. You sound like someone who has spent a lifetime running large companies. I've always been interested in corporate governance. I just never sought publicity. He shook his head with a smile, full of surprises. By the way, do you know Gilbert Litchfield from the marketing department? Must be a relative? My son, I replied calmly. Blakelock raised his eyebrows in surprise. Your son? And he didn't know about the deal? It was supposed to be a surprise. Well, judging by the look on his face when he walked into the conference room, the surprise was definitely a success. Blakelock hummed. Family business, then? Planning on promoting him? Only if he deserves it, my answer was firm. There's no room for nepotism in business. Blakelock gave me a studied look, then nodded with renewed respect. I like you already, Norris Litchfield. I spent the rest of the day getting to know the company's key people and reviewing internal reports. To my surprise, Delancey didn't show up in my office, even though, as head of PR, she should have been one of the first to know the news. Gilbert had probably already contacted her, and they were now feverishly considering their strategy. Around 6 in the evening, I decided it was time to head back to my son's house. Now it wasn't just an opportunity to relax after a day's work. It was the next act of our family drama. When I entered the house, Gilbert and Delancey were sitting in the living room with tense faces. They were obviously waiting for me. Delancey jumped up as soon as I crossed the threshold. Norris, is it true? Gilbert said you bought the company? Controlling interest, I corrected, taking off my coat. But yes, I own TechnoAge now. She exchanged a quick glance with Gilbert, then smiled in surprise. That's amazing. Why didn't you tell us earlier that you had these opportunities? We could have. She hesitated but quickly continued. We could have helped you with that decision. I didn't need help. I made my way into the living room and sat down in the chair across from them. I've been making financial decisions on my own for 40 years. Gilbert coughed nervously. Dad, we're just stunned. You never told us you had a fortune like this. Why would I have mentioned it? I asked calmly. So that you would treat me differently? With more respect, perhaps. A man doesn't have to be rich to earn respect, Gilbert, especially from his own children. They both looked ashamed, but I could see that behind that facade, their brains were working feverishly, counting the numbers and opportunities that my sudden wealth had opened up to them. Of course, Dad, Gilbert pitched forward with genuine, or well-played, contrition. I know the last few weeks have been unideal. Delancey and I have been too busy with work and may not have given you the attention you deserve. Maybe. I raised an eyebrow. Gilbert, you threw a rag at me and called me a servant. He blushed. I was out of line, I apologize. It's been a difficult time for all of us. After Mom died, with the problems at the company, which have now been resolved, Delancey put in, smiling again. Thanks to you, Norris. You saved the company. And your jobs, I added. Bye? That bye hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. They exchanged worried glances. What do you mean? Gilbert asked cautiously. I mentioned at the meeting today that I'm planning some mid-level restructuring to improve efficiency. It may affect your positions as well. Delancey turned pale. But Norris, we're family. There's no room for nepotism in business. I repeated the words I'd said to Blakelock. Every employee has to earn their place and their paycheck. Gilbert looked lost. You want to fire us? After all we've done for you? I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. And what exactly have you done for me, Gilbert? Sheltered me in my house after the accident and then treated me like a domestic servant? Left to-do lists on the kitchen table? Demanded that I do your laundry and cook for your guests? We were just asking for help. He started, but I held up my hand, stopping him. Don't. We both know how it really was. There was a heavy pause. I could see them frantically trying to find a new approach, a new strategy. What do you plan to do with the company? Gilbert finally asked, trying to move the conversation in a more businesslike direction. What any responsible owner should be doing is taking it to the next level. The first step is to start up the new production line you've all been talking about for so long. Then it's optimizing the management structure, eliminating inefficiencies. And we're one of those inefficiencies? Delancey's voice held an ill-concealed alarm. That's up to you. I stood up. On your work, your professionalism, and your attitude. Not just to me, but to the company as a whole. I headed for the stairs, but stopped on the first step. Oh yeah, one more thing. I'm moving tomorrow. Moving? Gilbert jumped up from the couch. Where to? Your house renovations aren't finished yet. I bought a new house. Or rather, rented one while the renovations are going on. A penthouse in the center of town. I think I'll be more comfortable there. But Dad... Gilbert looked confused. Are you uncomfortable here? Not that it's bad. I allowed myself a slight smile. I just don't want to be your servant anymore. With those words, I headed upstairs, leaving them to digest their new reality. In my room, I began to pack my things, feeling oddly peaceful. The revenge plan had begun to take effect, but I wasn't sure it was revenge anymore. More like justice. A lesson that was long overdue. The next day, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. On my new desk, I found a note from Gilbert, written in his neat handwriting. Dad, we need to talk. I'll be in your office at 8:30 if that's okay. Regards, Gilbert, respectfully. It's funny how quickly attitudes change when you're suddenly a millionaire and the boss. At exactly 8:30, there was a knock on the door, and Gilbert entered the office with a folder in his hands and a nervous smile on his face. Good morning, Dad. He sat down across from me. I thought you might be interested in learning more about my department's current projects. Sure, I leaned back in my chair. I'm all ears. Gilbert spent the next half hour talking with uncharacteristic enthusiasm about marketing strategies, target audiences, and performance metrics. I listened intently, noting that many of his ideas were actually quite good, though they needed refinement. One last thing, he pulled a glossy brochure out of a folder. I've conceptualized a new advertising campaign for our automation system. Small business focus, just like you said at the meeting yesterday. If you approve, we could start as early as next quarter. I looked over the materials carefully. Not bad, but the budget is too bloated. We need to optimize spending on outdoor advertising and redirect funds to digital. Gilbert blinked, clearly surprised by my quick and professional analysis. Yes, of course, I'll rework it. As he was about to leave, I stopped him. By the way, Gilbert, you're meeting with a client from Leventus Systems today, right? He froze in the doorway. Yes, but how did you know? I looked at the calendar of all the executives' meetings. I want to attend this meeting. You want to attend? His voice trembled. Yes, Leventus is a potentially major client, and I want to see for myself that we offer them the best possible terms. Gilbert swallowed. Sure thing, Dad. The meeting is at 2 o'clock in conference room B. When he left, I called Delancey and invited her to meet me in my office. She showed up 15 minutes later, impeccably dressed and with a professional smile. You wanted to see me, Norris? Yes, have a seat, I pointed to the chair opposite. I've been looking into the structure of the PR department and noticed some inconsistencies. Her smile trembled slightly. Inconsistencies? Your department is one of the most expensive in the company, but the performance metrics don't match the costs. We've lost 3 key industry partnerships in the last year, despite an increased PR budget. Delancey tensed. We're operating in a challenging environment. The market is unstable. The market is always unstable, I interrupted. The PR department's job is to adapt to those conditions, not use them as an excuse. She pressed her lips together, but held back her objection. What are you suggesting? A complete restructuring of your department, cutting ineffective areas, reallocating resources, a new communication strategy. You have a week to submit a plan. A week? She didn't hide her indignation. That's impossible. For a good manager, it's quite possible. I looked at her calmly. If you need help, I can assign a consultant. No need, she retorted. I can handle it. Great. I look forward to your plan next Monday. Also, Delancey, I paused. I hear you're planning a corporate dinner for the partners next month? Yeah, it's our tradition. Cancel it. We'll have a more chamber event for key clients instead, without too much pomp and waste. She looked like I'd slapped her. These annual dinners were her pride. an opportunity to shine in front of her coworkers and partners. Whatever you say, she stood up. Anything else? Yes, one last thing. I want you to attend a meeting with Leventus Systems today at 2. But it's a marketing department meeting. It's a company management level meeting now, I smiled. I'll see you at 2. Left alone, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Gilbert and Delancey were, for the first time in a long time, talking to me as someone deserving of respect. Granted, it was a forced respect based on fear and self-interest, but it was a start. The meeting with Leventus went better than I expected. Gilbert was well prepared, his presentation clear and compelling. Delancey, despite her obvious irritation, answered questions about the company's reputation in a professional manner. I watched them with a new feeling. Not pride, no, but a certain recognition of their professionalism. When the Leventus representatives left, satisfied with our proposals, I congratulated the team on a successful meeting. Gilbert was literally glowing with praise, and Delancey allowed herself her first genuine smile all day. Good job, I told them both. Keep up the good work. That evening, I moved into my new temporary home, a spacious penthouse overlooking the city. Unpacking, I felt free for the first time in a long time. No to-do lists on the kitchen table, no condescending glances, no demands to scrub the floors or cook dinner. Looking out at the city at night from the panoramic windows of my new living room, I pondered my plan. It had begun to come to fruition, but that was only the beginning. There were still corporate changes ahead, new rules, and perhaps most importantly, the opportunity to finally show Gilbert and Delancey that respect couldn't be bought with money, but was very easily lost through disrespect for others, especially those they considered weak and insignificant. I raised my glass of wine, mentally addressing Penelope. You've always said that money is just a tool. It's time to use that tool to teach a lesson that is long overdue. The first thing I did the morning after the move was to call all the department heads to a general meeting. The spacious conference room quickly filled with people, among whom I noticed both Gilbert, who took a seat in the far corner, and Delancey sitting with a tense expression next to her colleagues from the PR department. When everyone had gathered, I stood in front of them and announced the new rules that would go into effect immediately. First, a complete overhaul of budgeting, I began. Each department must submit a detailed expense report for the last year in justification for all expenditures over $10,000. A whisper ran through the room. Many executives exchanged worried glances. Second, a new reporting system. Weekly reports on key performance indicators, not in general terms, but with specific numbers and results. I noticed Delancey tapping her fingers nervously on the desk. Her department was notorious for vague reports and vague wording. Third, transparency of communications. All internal project discussions must be documented and available to related departments. No closed-door meetings without minutes. This rule clearly struck a chord with many in attendance who were accustomed to resolving issues in a small circle. And last for today is a review of travel expenses. No business class flights for trips shorter than 5 hours. No five-star hotels without my personal approval. I watched Delancey's face grow increasingly tense. She was known for her love of luxurious business trips and always insisted on the best rooms and first-class service. These changes are not a punishment, I continued more gently. They are necessary measures to revitalize the company. Techno Age has great potential, but we must be responsible in managing our resources. In a month's time, I will conduct the first evaluation of the effectiveness of these changes. Who has questions? Hands went up almost simultaneously. I spent the next 40 minutes answering questions, explaining details, and reassuring anxious executives. Gilbert remained silent, watching intently. Delancey asked a few pointed questions, trying to defend her department's usual practices, but I was adamant. After the meeting, I returned to my office and summoned Gilbert. He appeared a few minutes later, looking unusually serious. These new rules, are they really necessary? He asked, closing the door behind him. Absolutely, I pointed to his chair. The company has been operating in a wasteful mode for too long. We need to become more efficient. Gilbert sat down, nervously adjusting his tie. Some of these measures seem redundant, especially for departments that are already doing well. Like what? I raised an eyebrow. For example, my department, he straightened. We've always stayed within budget and performed well. Really? I opened the folder in front of me. According to the latest reports, your department exceeded its advertising budget by 18%, with a conversion increase of only 3%. That's not what I'd call an efficient use of resources. Gilbert turned pale. He clearly hadn't expected me to have already studied all the reports. We've been investing in a long-term strategy, he tried to explain. We'll see results in the coming quarters. Perhaps, I closed the folder, but now you'll have to prove it with concrete numbers, not generalities about long-term strategies. Gilbert looked confused and a little hurt. This was the first time in his life that his actions had been subjected to such scrupulous analysis. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss? I asked. He paused, then reluctantly said, Delancey is very upset about the corporate dinner being canceled. It was her biggest event of the year. And the most wasteful, I added. Last year's dinner cost the company an amount comparable to the quarterly salaries of 5 engineers. I prefer to invest that money in development rather than in ostentatious luxury, but our partners expect a reliable and efficient partnership, I interrupted. They'll prefer a stable partner with reasonable expenses to someone who's going broke on useless activities. Gilbert gave up. I understand. I doubt it, I said quietly. But in time, I hope you'll understand. He left in a dejected mood, and I was left pondering how deeply the company's culture needed to be changed. It wasn't just about financial performance. It was about core values, about what really matters in business and in life. The next 2 weeks were intense. I immersed myself in the work, learning about every aspect of the company, meeting with employees, and visiting the production and development departments. Many were surprised by this attention from the owner. The previous management rarely left the upper floors of the office building. Gilbert and Delancey gradually adapted to the new reality. Gilbert, to his credit, took a serious approach to reorganizing his department, cutting unnecessary costs and streamlining processes. Delancey was less enthusiastic, but she too was forced to submit to the new rules. Their attitudes toward me were also changing. The initial shock and attempts at ingratiation were replaced by a more complex mix of emotions, respect mixed with resentment, recognition of my competence along with deafening resistance. In the 3rd week of my ownership of the company, an incident occurred that was a turning point in our family dynamic. I was in a meeting with the development executives when Delancey burst into the meeting room without a knock. Norris, this is outrageous. She waved some papers around. You rejected the budget for the press tour. It's the most important event of the quarter. There was an awkward silence in the room. The 6 executives froze, not knowing how to react to this outburst. Delancey, I calmly rose from my seat. We're in a meeting right now. If you have questions about the budget, make an appointment through my assistant. An appointment? She laughed with mild hysteria. You're my father-in-law, not royalty. I heard someone in the audience gasp quietly. Apparently not everyone was aware of our kinship. I'm the owner of the company, I replied in the same calm tone, and we're discussing an important project right now. Please step outside and wait for the meeting to end. Delancey looked like she was about to object, but then looked back at those present and realized how inappropriate her behavior was. She turned abruptly and walked out, slamming the door loudly. I apologize for this interruption, I said, returning to the interrupted discussion. So, where were we? The meeting continued, but I could feel the gazes of those present lingering on me from time to time. The news of the family connection between the company owner and the department heads would surely spread around the office by the end of the day. After the meeting, I found Delancey in her office. She was sitting at her desk, still angry, but already realizing the inappropriateness of her outburst. What happened is unacceptable, I said, closing the door behind me. You embarrassed both yourself and me. You turned down a crucial project with no explanation. She was still trying to defend herself. I rejected it because it was redundant and inefficient. Spending $120,000 on a press tour for 10 journalists is a waste. But there's no buts, Delancey. You can organize an equally effective press tour for half that amount. And if you can't, perhaps we should rethink the leadership structure of the PR department. That threat silenced her. She sat looking at me with poorly concealed indignation. One more thing, I added. Don't ever mention our kinship in a work setting again. I'm not your father-in-law here. I'm the owner of the company, and I expect appropriate professional treatment. I walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Returning to my office, I ran into Gilbert, who apparently had already heard about the incident. "Dad, what happened to Delancey?" He looked worried. "Your wife made a scene at an important meeting over a rejected budget," I replied. I explained to her that such behavior is unacceptable in a professional environment. She was upset. "We all get upset sometimes, Gilbert. But adults control their emotions, especially at work." He wanted to object to something, but changed his mind. Instead, he just nodded and said, "I'll talk to her." A week after this incident, I organized a small corporate event for key clients and partners. Instead of a pompous dinner at an expensive restaurant, I rented a cozy room in a historic building downtown. Instead of an overly formal dress code, a relaxed atmosphere. Instead of star chefs, a high-quality but reasonable catering service. To my surprise, the event turned out to be much more successful than last year's. Clients and partners appreciated the opportunity to socialize in a more comfortable environment without unnecessary pathos and ceremony. In the middle of the evening, I gave a short speech introducing the new vision of the company. Gilbert and Delancey stood among the guests, compelled to listen to my every word. "To me, business isn't just numbers on paper," I said. "It's people, their labor, their ideas, their dedication." Over the past month, I've seen how many talented and dedicated employees work at TechnoAge. They deserve a company that values their contributions and manages resources wisely. I paused, circling the audience with my gaze. My vision for TechnoAge is a company that values efficiency over ostentatious luxury, where respect is earned by results, not titles, where everyone, from the rank and file to the executive, understands that we work together for a common goal. I noticed Delancey whisper something in Gilbert's ear, but he only shook his head as he continued to listen intently. "Recent events in my life have made me rethink a lot of things," I continued, moving on to the more personal part. Losing my spouse after 40 years of marriage, having to move due to a domestic accident, I found myself in a situation where I had to rely on others. And that reliance taught me the value of true respect and support. I didn't explicitly mention how I was treated in the Gilbert and Delancey home, but made a fairly transparent hint. Sometimes people of power or position forget simple human decency. They begin to regard those around them, especially those who seem less successful or influential, as unworthy of respect. I saw Gilbert lower his eyes and Delancey struggled to keep a polite expression on her face. But a man's true worth is not measured by his bank account or his position. It is measured by his treatment of others, especially those who cannot return the favor. As I finished my speech, I received a hearty round of applause. Many came up to me to personally thank me for my new approach to running the company. Gilbert and Delancey stayed away, obviously feeling uncomfortable after my words. Near the end of the evening, Eleanor Wilkins, our largest client and an astute businesswoman, approached me. "Impressive speech, Norris," she said, shaking my hand, "especially the part about the value of a human being." "I think there's a personal story behind those words, though," I smiled. "We all have a story, Eleanor." "True," she nodded, "and yours seems to be quite unusual. It's not every day you meet a man who hides his fortune for the sake of—" "What exactly?" "For the simple life," I answered. "Money changes people, and not always for the better." "I agree." She glanced toward Gilbert and Delancey, who were watching us from a distance. "Your children, I presume?" "My son and his wife," I confirmed. "They work for the company, and were unaware of your condition until recently?" Her insight was impressive. "They didn't know," I admitted. "It's been an enlightening revelation for all of us." Eleanor smiled understandingly. "Life is full of lessons, Norris. I hope your children have learned theirs." "Time will tell," I said, "but I'm an optimist." After the event, I returned to my penthouse suite feeling oddly peaceful. The evening had been a success. My vision for the company had been enthusiastically received. And, most importantly, I had publicly articulated my values without resorting to direct accusations. Sitting in my chair with a glass of whiskey, I thought about Penelope. Would she approve of my actions, or would she find them unnecessarily harsh? "You've always been kinder than me, Pen," I whispered into the void. "But you haven't tolerated disrespect either." In 40 years of marriage, Penelope had never once asked me about our finances. She knew we lived comfortably, but never inquired about the details. "You handle that part of our lives, Norris, and I trust you." she would say when I tried to discuss investment decisions with her. At first, I thought she just wasn't interested in the topic. Later, I realized it was her way of expressing trust. She knew I would never jeopardize our safety, and that was enough. I never told her how significant our fortune had become, partly out of a habit of modesty, partly out of fear that money might change our simple but happy lives. Now looking back, I wondered if it had been the right decision. Maybe I should have trusted her completely as she had trusted me. My musings were interrupted by a phone call. It was Gilbert. "Dad," his voice sounded unusually serious. "Can I talk to you?" "In person." "It's almost midnight, Gilbert." "I know, but this is important. Can I come over?" I hesitated, then agreed. 30 minutes later, he was at my place. As he entered the penthouse, he looked around with undisguised amazement. My new home was strikingly different from the modest house I'd lived in with Penelope. "Impressive," he said, walking into the living room. "I never realized you had such taste." "People often underestimate those they don't know well," I replied, pointing to a chair. "What did you want to talk about?" Gilbert sat down, rubbing his hands together nervously. "About your speech today." "It was very personal." "Yes, it was." I poured myself another whiskey. "You want one?" He nodded, and I held out his glass. "I know that Delancey and I have treated you in a bad way," he began, "but you have to understand, we've been under tremendous pressure. The job, the mortgage, the uncertainty with the future of the company." "Gilbert," I interrupted him, "pressure is no excuse for disrespect, especially to your parents." He took a sip of whiskey, wrinkling his nose at the strength. "I know, and I'm really sorry, especially about that rag story. It was unforgivable. And yet you're looking for excuses." "No," he shook his head. "I'm just trying to explain. We're not bad people, Dad. We just got lost somewhere along the way." I looked at my son carefully. He had changed noticeably in the last month. More serious, more responsible. Perhaps this lesson had done him good after all. "Does Delancey know you're here?" I asked. "No," he looked away. "She's still too proud to admit she's wrong. But she's changed too, believe me. This month has been a sobering." "I hope so, Gilbert." "For both your sakes." He finished his whiskey and set the empty glass on the table. "There's something else I've been meaning to ask. Why didn't you ever tell us about your condition? Not even your mom?" I sighed, bringing my thoughts back to Penelope again. "Your mother knew we were wealthy. She just wasn't interested in the details. And I wanted you to learn to appreciate hard work and honesty, not easy money. Maybe I was wrong to hide the truth, but I was afraid that money would change our family." "And yet it did change them," Gilbert said quietly. "Eventually." "Yes," I agreed, "but not in the way I feared. They showed their true faces, and perhaps that's for the best." Gilbert stood up, preparing to leave. "Thanks for listening to me, Dad, and for not firing us. A lot of people in your shoes would have done just that." "I haven't decided what to do with your positions yet," I answered honestly. "That will depend on your future work and behavior." He nodded understandingly. "Fair enough. I won't let you down, this time sincerely." As the door closed behind him, I returned to my thoughts about Penelope and how I'd kept the truth about our financial situation from her. Maybe I should have been more open. Maybe it would have prevented the problems we were facing now. But there was no changing the past. I could only move forward, learning from my mistakes and trying not to repeat them in the future. And maybe helping Gilbert and Delancey learn their own lessons from this history. It's been 2 months since I acquired a controlling interest in TechnoAge. In that time, the company has changed significantly. It has become more efficient, more transparent, more focused on results than process. The new production line was successfully launched, and the first customer feedback exceeded our expectations. I met with the contractor renovating my old house every week. After another such visit, I realized that I didn't want to just go back to my old home. I needed something new to symbolize my new life. I asked the architect to completely redesign the project, keeping only the foundation of the structure. "Are you sure?" he asked doubtfully. "It will greatly increase the cost and time of the work." "I'm sure," I replied. "Money isn't a problem, and I'm in no hurry to get anywhere." I spent the next weeks off work, choosing materials, furniture, and appliances for the renovated house. It was a strange but pleasant feeling, to create a space completely according to my desires, without looking at the opinion of others and without limiting myself in means. In parallel with the renovation of the house, the company was being reorganized. I scrutinized the work of each department, identifying inefficient processes and redundant positions. By the middle of the third month of my ownership of TechnoAge, the reorganization plan was ready. I convened the board of directors to present the plan. Among those present were Blakelock, now acting as an advisor, and the heads of all key departments. Gilbert and Delancey were not among them. They did not hold positions high enough to attend such meetings. Ladies and gentlemen, I began as everyone took their seats. Over the past few months, I've taken a deep dive into the workings of our company. I have seen many strengths and many areas for improvement. Today, I am presenting a comprehensive reorganization plan that will allow TechnoAge to not only emerge from this crisis, but to become an industry leader. I spent the next hour detailing my vision of the new company structure, changes in management processes, and reallocation of resources. The plan was ambitious but realistic, the result of my years of experience in financial analysis and several months of intensive study of the technology sector. One of the key changes will involve the marketing department, I continued. The current structure is redundant and inefficient. I propose reducing the number of middle managers and redistributing their responsibilities between the rank and file and upper-level managers. Blakelock looked at me with a slight smile. He knew these changes would directly affect my son. Similar changes await the PR department. I moved on to the next slide. We'll cut the budget by 30% without sacrificing efficiency, redirecting resources to communication channels that really work. After the presentation, the board unanimously approved the reorganization plan. Blakelock stayed late after the meeting to personally congratulate me. "Impressive job, Norris," he said, shaking my hand. "You exceed all my expectations." "And how will your son and daughter-in-law take the news about their departments?" "They'll have to adapt like everyone else," I replied. "There's no room for sentimentality in business." Blakelock nodded respectfully. "You're a born leader. It's a shame you've kept that talent hidden for so long." "All in good time," I said, "and now it seems my time has come." That evening, I summoned Gilbert and Delancey to my office. They came in together, tense but outwardly calm. "Have a seat." I pointed to the chairs across from my desk. "Today, the board of directors approved a reorganization plan for the company. I wanted to personally inform you of the changes that will affect your departments and positions." Delancey nervously gripped the armrests of her chair. "And what are those changes?" "Substantial." I opened a folder of documents. "The PR department will be cut by 40%. Your management position will be eliminated. In its place, a communications manager position will be created with a much narrower scope of responsibilities and a corresponding salary adjustment." "Adjustment?" She squinted. "You mean a reduction?" "By 35%, I said calmly, without emotion. "Given the actual workload and market rates, that's more than fair." Delancey went pale. This is outrageous. I've worked for this company for 5 years. I built the entire PR department from scratch. And in the last 2 years, the efficiency of that department has decreased by 20%, while the budget has increased by 30%, I parried. "It's not personal, Delancey. It's business." She opened her mouth to object, but Gilbert put his hand on her knee, stopping her. "What about me?" he asked quietly. I shifted my gaze to my son. "Your position will also be restructured. Instead of department head, you'll become senior marketing manager. The pay cut is 25%. Gilbert looked as if he expected the worst. "I see. And when do these changes take effect?" "From the 1st of next month. You have 2 weeks to decide whether to stay with the company under the new terms or seek other opportunities." Delancey jumped up from her seat. "This is revenge, isn't it?" "For the way we treated you?" I looked at her calmly. "If it was revenge, Delancey, I'd just fire both of you. It's a business decision based on objective performance analysis. You get exactly what you deserve with your work. No more, no less. Let's go." Gilbert stood up and took his wife's hand. "We need to discuss this at home." After they left, I sat in my office for a long time yet, reflecting on our conversation. I was honest. It was indeed a business decision based on objective metrics, but I couldn't deny that I felt a certain satisfaction in seeing them realize the consequences of their actions. A week after that conversation, my new home was ready. It was completely transformed. Spacious, bright rooms, modern appliances, comfortable furniture. The house kept its soul, but became much better than before. Moving day was symbolic for me, the beginning of a new chapter of life, without pretense, without self-restraint, without compromising my own desires. When the last box was unpacked, I stepped out into the garden, now replanned by an experienced landscaper. Among the new plants and paths, I kept the rose bush that Penelope and I had planted in our first year of marriage. It had miraculously survived a water main break and was now blooming again, symbolizing the continuity between past and present. "Would you approve of my actions, Pen?" I asked quietly, touching the delicate petals. "Am I being too hard on them?" The wind ruffled the leaves slightly and I thought I heard her soft voice. "You always did what you thought was right, and you were usually right." That same evening, I got a call from Gilbert. "Dad, we've made a decision," he said without preamble. "We're staying with the company." "Both of you?" I was a little surprised. "Yes." Delancey isn't thrilled, but she realizes that it's going to be hard to find a comparable position in the current market situation. And me? I want to prove that I can be a valuable employee, even without a privileged position. That's a mature decision, Gilbert. We've been rethinking a lot of things over the last few months. You could hear the unaccustomed sincerity in his voice, especially me. The way we've treated you, it's unforgivable. I realize that a simple apology won't fix anything, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry, and I'm going to try to make it right. Not for the position or the money, but because it's the right thing to do. I was quiet for a moment, mulling over his words. I appreciate your honesty, Gilbert. Time will tell how sincere those intentions are. I understand, he sighed. By the way, I hear you've already moved into your updated home? Yes, today. Delancey and I would like to come visit. When you're ready. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to keep them at a distance, keep them out of my new life. But another part, maybe the part that still remembered Gilbert as a little boy, was willing to give it another chance. Maybe next month, I said finally. Give me time to settle in. Sure, Dad? Thanks. The first month in the new house passed like a blur. Working, settling in, getting used to my new status and opportunities. It was the first time I allowed myself to really use my money without hiding or holding back. It was unusual, but pleasant. The reorganization of the company was in full swing. Gilbert and Delancey, as promised, remained in their new, more modest positions. To my surprise, they were both working hard to prove their professional worth. Gilbert especially. He plunged into his work with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him before. His projects were thoughtful, effective, innovative. Perhaps the loss of his privileged position forced him to finally reach his potential. Delancey was having a hard time adjusting. I often noticed her irritated look at meetings, especially when the new head of the PR department, a young and energetic woman, proposed ideas that Delancey had once rejected. But even she was gradually finding her place in the new company structure. One evening, about 2 months after the move, I invited them both to dinner. It was the first such invitation since this whole affair began. They arrived exactly at the appointed time, with a nice bottle of wine and a bouquet for the house. I walked them through the updated rooms, showing them the changes and improvements. Their reaction was a mixture of admiration and slight envy. The house really did turn out great. Over dinner, we talked mostly about work, avoiding personal topics. Gilbert talked about his new project, Delancey about working with outside consultants. I shared plans for expanding production. It was a polite but somewhat strained conversation between three professionals, not a family dinner. When dessert was finished, Gilbert finally broached the topic we'd all been avoiding. Dad, I realize that Delancey and I have probably ruined our family relationship with our actions. But I want you to know, we've both learned a lot during this time, and I hope that someday, not now, but in the future, we'll be able to regain at least some of what we've lost. Delancey was silent, but I could see she was watching my reaction carefully. Gilbert, I set the napkin aside, I don't hold a grudge against you. Indeed, I don't. But trust once broken is not rebuilt easily or quickly. I'm not closing the door on the possibility of rebuilding a relationship, but it will be a new relationship. One based on mutual respect, not condescension on your part or pretense on mine. That's fair enough, Delancey said quietly. We've earned your distrust. And I have to admit that I was wrong. In so many ways. It was the first real admission on her part, and I appreciated the effort it took for her to say those words. Time will tell, I said. For now, let's focus on work. We have a company to take to the top of the market. They left shortly after that, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I walked out into the garden to Penelope's rose bush. The night was quiet and clear, the stars shining in the cloudless sky. I did it, Pen, I whispered. Created a new life. And you know, I think it can be a good one. Not like it was with you, nothing will ever be like that, but worthy. Over the next few months, TechnoAge truly transformed, gradually becoming a leader in its niche. The new production line exceeded expectations. The customer base expanded, and the company's reputation was solidified. Gilbert and Delancey adapted to their new roles, without privileges, without special treatment, but with the opportunity to prove themselves professionally. Gilbert especially excelled by developing innovative marketing strategies that were being recognized even outside the company. Our personal relationship remained discreet but correct. I could not fully forgive them for the past, but I felt satisfaction in seeing them grow and change under the pressure of new circumstances. For myself, this time was a period of discovery and liberation. I finally allowed myself to live life to the fullest without hiding behind a mask of modesty or limiting my possibilities. I traveled, met new people, tried new hobbies. I enjoyed the freedom and power that money gives, using it not for ostentatious wealth, but to create a comfortable, interesting, fulfilling life. One day, about a year after all these events, I overheard Delancey talking to a coworker in the company cafeteria. And you know, at first I was furious, she said quietly. Thought he was humiliating us on purpose, getting revenge for the way we treated him. But now I realize he was just doing us justice. Put us in the place we really deserved with our work and attitude. And that was an important lesson. Painful, but necessary. I stayed out of their conversation, quietly withdrawing, but those words stayed with me. Perhaps my lesson had indeed been learned. Perhaps this story had made us all better in the end. Me, by eliminating the need to pretend, Gilbert and Delancey, by teaching me to value real merit over the appearance of success. That evening, sitting in my garden with a glass of good whiskey, I reflected on all the twists and turns that had led me to this moment. About 40 years of happy marriage to Penelope, about the years of hidden wealth, about the difficult relationship with my son, about how a random plumbing accident led to a complete rethinking of my entire life. Sometimes you have to lose what you have to truly appreciate it, I said, turning to the stars. And sometimes you have to lose the respect of others to learn to respect yourself. I raised my glass in a silent toast to Penelope, to the past that had shaped me, and to the future I was now building on my own terms. Back at the company, Gilbert and Delancey continued in their new positions, gradually regaining their professional reputations, but no longer without the privileges and advantages that their kinship with the owner had given them. They accepted their new position, not of their own free will, but under the pressure of circumstances they had created. And I had finally found a balance between the modesty I had always valued and the opportunities my fortune afforded me. I no longer pretended to be less successful than I really was, but I no longer succumbed to the lure of ostentatious luxury. I simply lived what I thought was right, enjoying the freedom to be myself, without masks, without compromise, without looking at other people's expectations. And in this new life, built on the foundations of the past, but looking to the future, I finally found what I had always been looking for, true fulfillment in who I was and what I had accomplished. Not only in terms of financial success, but also in terms of the human values I have always placed above all else.